You were never supposed to survive that night." His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it didn't match the way my hands were still shaking as I stood in that quiet room, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like something expensive and unfamiliar. And for a second I couldn't answer him because my mind kept dragging me back to the parking lot, to the cold concrete pressing against my cheek, to the rain soaking through my clothes until I couldn't tell what was water and what was something warmer, thicker. I remember thinking how strange it was, that everything felt so quiet even though my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, like drums echoing in an empty hallway. I had tried to move, just a few inches, just enough to get my hands free, but the plastic around my wrists only tightened, and I remember whispering to myself, "Just breathe, Emily, just breathe," because panic wouldn't help. Panic never helped. And somewhere behind me there were voices, low and impatient, like they were discussing something routine, something that didn't involve a human life at all. And I realized in that moment how small I was, how invisible, how easy it would be for the world to keep moving without ever noticing I was gone. And that was the part that scared me the most, not the cold, not the pain, but the silence of it, the idea that nothing would change. Then the sound came, soft at first, tires rolling over wet asphalt, slow, controlled, not rushing, and everything shifted. The voices behind me paused, just for a second, and I felt it, that subtle change in the air, like a storm about to break. Headlights washed over the ground in front of me, turning the rain into silver streaks, and I squeezed my eyes shut because the light hurt, because I didn't want to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope meant disappointment. But then a door opened, and it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, like whoever stepped out didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Footsteps followed, steady, unhurried, each one measured. Like he already knew exactly how this would end. I forced myself to look up, just enough to see a silhouette cutting through the light, tall, still, and for a moment I thought maybe I was imagining him. Maybe my brain was creating something to hold on to before everything went dark. But then he spoke, and his voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried anyway. "Let her go." Simple words, but they landed like something final, like a decision had already been made long before he arrived. I remember the way the others reacted, not fear at first, just confusion, like they couldn't understand why anyone would step into something that didn't concern them. And I almost wanted to laugh. Because they didn't see it yet. They didn't see him the way I did, standing there like the rain didn't touch him, like the night itself had stepped aside to let him through, seconds stretched, thin and fragile. And then everything changed, not in a chaotic way, not loud or messy, just fast, controlled, precise, like watching a door close and knowing it would never open again. And suddenly the space around me was empty, the voices gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of rain hitting the pavement. And he was closer now, crouching beside me, his presence filling the silence in a way that didn't feel suffocating, just certain. I felt his hands at my wrists, careful, not rushing, like he understood that even small movements mattered, that trust wasn't something you could demand, it had to be given. And when the pressure around my wrists loosened, I didn't move right away, I just stayed there, staring at him because I didn't understand why he was here, why he had stopped, why he had chosen me. And then he looked at me, really looked, like he was memorizing something. And for the first time that night, I felt something shift inside my chest, something that wasn't fear, not exactly, something sharper, more dangerous, because it felt like recognition, like he already knew more about me than he should. And his voice dropped, softer now, but heavier. "Who did this to you?" And I opened my mouth to answer, to explain, to tell him everything, but the words caught in my throat because, deep down, beneath the shock and the exhaustion and the disbelief, I realized something that made my pulse spike all over again. He wasn't asking to understand. He was asking so he could decide what came next. My lips parted but no sound came out, not because I did not have an answer, but because I suddenly understood that the answer mattered more than I was ready for. His eyes did not leave mine, steady and unreadable, like he was waiting, not impatient, just certain that I would speak. And the rain kept falling around us, softer now, like the world had stepped back to listen. I swallowed, my throat dry despite the cold, and finally forced the words out. It was someone I trusted, my voice barely above a whisper, but he heard it. I knew he did because something in his expression shifted, not softer, not warmer, just sharper, like a line had been drawn somewhere I could not see. His fingers tightened slightly around the cut plastic at my wrists before he let it fall to the ground. And then he stood, smooth and controlled, offering his hand without saying anything else. I hesitated, just for a second, because everything about this felt unreal. Because men like him did not appear out of nowhere and change the direction of your life in a single moment. But I had nowhere else to go, no one else coming. So I placed my hand in his, and the second our skin touched, I felt it again, that strange sense of recognition, like I had stepped into something I did not understand yet. He pulled me up carefully, adjusting his grip when I swayed slightly, not strong enough to stand on my own. "Easy," he said quietly, his voice lower now, closer, and I hated how much that single word steadied me, how quickly my body responded to the calm in his tone, like it had been waiting for it all night. He guided me toward the car, the same black vehicle that had cut through the darkness minutes earlier, the door already open as if someone had anticipated this exact moment. Warm air spilled out to meet the cold rain, carrying the faint scent of leather and something clean, controlled, like everything about him. I paused at the edge, looking back over my shoulder at the empty space behind us. It did not make sense how quickly everything had changed, how the chaos had simply disappeared, like it had never existed. "Do not look back," he said, not harsh, not commanding, just certain, and something in me listened. I slid into the seat, the softness of it almost shocking against my cold skin, my hands trembling as I pulled the blanket tighter around myself. The door closed with a quiet finality that made my chest tighten, and for the first time since the night had begun, I realized I was no longer outside, no longer exposed. I was inside his world now, whether I understood it or not. He moved around the car and took the seat beside me instead of the driver's seat, which confused me until the engine started anyway. Someone else up front, unseen, silent. The car began to move, smooth and effortless, like the road had been cleared before we even arrived. I watched the rain streak across the window, the city lights blurring into something distant and unreachable. "You are not safe," he said after a moment, and I turned to look at him, my heart picking up again. "I know," I whispered, because I did, because something inside me had already accepted that whatever happened tonight was not over. It was only beginning. His gaze shifted slightly, studying me again, like he was measuring something, not my fear, but my understanding. "You saw something," he continued, and it was not a question. I froze, every instinct telling me to deny it, to say no, to pretend this was just a random act. But his eyes held mine, and lying suddenly felt pointless. "I did not mean to," I said instead, my voice unsteady. "I was just in the wrong place." His jaw tightened just enough for me to notice, and then he leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, like he had expected that answer. "All along, there is no such thing as the wrong place," he said, almost to himself. "Only consequences." The words settled between us, heavy and unavoidable, and I felt my fingers curl into the fabric of the blanket. "What happens now?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out of me because I needed something, any kind of certainty. He did not answer right away, his gaze shifting back to the window, watching the city pass by like it belonged to him, like every street, every light, every shadow answered to the same quiet authority he carried so effortlessly. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, but it carried something deeper, something that made my breath catch again. "Now," he said, slowly, turning back to me. They realized they chose the wrong person to touch. And in that moment, I understood something that sent a different kind of chill through me. Not fear, not exactly. Something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to relief. He was not asking what happened so he could help me move on. He was asking because whatever came next was already decided. I should have felt safe in that car, wrapped in warmth, moving through the city like nothing could reach me. But safety did not feel like this. It did not come with silence this heavy, or a man sitting beside me who spoke like decisions had already been made long before I understood the questions. I kept my eyes on the window, watching the blurred lights stretch into lines as we passed intersections I did not recognize, trying to ground myself in something familiar, counting breaths, counting seconds, anything to keep my thoughts from spiraling. But it did not work, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment again. The way everything had stopped when he arrived. The way the air itself had shifted, like the night had chosen a side, and I could not stop thinking about what he had said. There is no such thing as the wrong place. Only consequences, the words repeated in my mind, slow and deliberate, like they carried weight I had not fully understood yet. Where are we going? I asked finally, my voice steadier than I felt. He did not look at me right away, his gaze still fixed ahead, calm, controlled, like the movement of the car was an extension of him. Somewhere quiet. He replied, simple, but not comforting. Nothing about him was meant to comfort. It was meant to control, to contain, and I felt it in the way my body stayed still, in the way I did not argue, did not question further. Like some part of me already understood that resisting him was not an option I truly had. The car turned smoothly, leaving the main road behind, the city noise fading into something distant, replaced by a kind of silence that felt intentional, like even the world outside respected whatever boundary he carried with him. I shifted slightly in my seat, the blanket slipping just enough for the cold to remind me where I had been minutes ago, hours ago. I did not even know anymore. Time felt distorted, stretched between fear and something else I could not name. You are thinking too much, he said suddenly, and I froze, turning to him because I had not realized how obvious it was. His eyes met mine again, not invasive, not accusing, just aware. People do that when they are trying to make sense of something they cannot control, he added, and there it was again. That quiet precision in his words, like he understood me better than I understood myself. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head slightly. I am trying to understand why you stopped, I admitted, because that was the truth that would not leave me alone. Out of everything that had happened, that was the part that felt impossible. He could have driven past, could have ignored it, could have chosen not to involve himself. But he did not, and I needed to know why. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, almost unnoticeable, like the question had landed somewhere deeper than expected. I do not stop for things that do not concern me, he said after a moment, and the answer should have been simple, but it was not, because it left only one possibility. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the blanket. So I concerned you? I asked quietly, and this time he did look at me, fully, his gaze steady and unwavering, and for a second, I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with fear. You were already part of something, he said, and my heart skipped, because that was not an answer I was ready for. Not yet. What does that mean? I pressed, but he did not respond immediately, the car slowing as we approached a set of gates that opened without hesitation. Like our arrival had been expected long before we reached them, the world outside shifted again, from empty streets to something larger, quieter, controlled. I felt it before I even saw it, the kind of place that did not exist by accident. The car rolled forward, and I realized with a growing sense of disbelief that wherever he was taking me, it was not temporary, it was not random, it was intentional, planned. The car came to a smooth stop, and for a moment, neither of us moved, the engine still running, the soft hum filling the silence between us. It means, he said finally, his voice lower now, quieter, but heavier than before, that tonight was not the beginning for you. I felt my breath catch, confusion mixing with something sharper, something closer to fear again, because I knew what that implied, even if I did not want to accept it. Then what was it? I asked, barely above a whisper, and he reached for the door, opening it slowly before stepping out into the stillness beyond, pausing just long enough to glance back at me, his expression unreadable, but his words clear. It was the moment you finally crossed into my world, and something inside me told me, with a certainty I could not explain, that there was no going back. For a moment, I did not move, my hand still wrapped tightly around the edge of the blanket as I stared at the open car door, at the stillness beyond it, at the way the world outside seemed too quiet, too controlled, like even the air here followed rules I did not understand, and I realized something that made my chest tighten. This place did not feel like somewhere you arrived by accident. It felt like somewhere you were brought, deliberately, carefully, like a decision had already been made. Long before I stepped inside that car, I swallowed slowly, forcing my body to move, to follow, because staying inside would not change anything. Nothing would. I stepped out onto the smooth ground, my shoes making the faintest sound against the surface, and the first thing I noticed was the silence, not empty, but intentional, like every noise had been filtered, controlled, contained. I looked around, taking in the structure in front of me, the clean lines, the tall windows glowing softly from within, everything precise, everything expensive, everything distant. It did not feel like a home. It felt like a place that existed outside of normal life, somewhere rules were different, somewhere people like me did not belong. "You are safe here," he said behind me, and I turned slightly, the words settling into me in a way that felt complicated, because safety from him and safety with him felt like two very different things, and I was not sure which one he meant. He stepped past me, moving toward the entrance without hesitation, like this space responded to him the same way the city had, like it already knew who he was. The doors opened before he reached them, smooth and silent, and I hesitated again, just for a second, because crossing that threshold felt like more than just walking into a building. It felt like crossing a line I could not uncross. But then I remembered his words. "You already crossed into my world." And something in me understood that this was only the next step, not the first. I followed him inside, the warmth hitting me immediately, wrapping around my cold skin in a way that made me realize how long I had been holding tension in my body. The lights were soft, not harsh, casting everything in a calm glow that should have been comforting but somehow was not. It only made everything feel more surreal, more removed from reality. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do, where to go, what was expected of me, and that uncertainty settled deep in my chest, heavier than fear. Because fear I understood, but this was something else, something unfamiliar. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair nearby, and I obeyed before I even thought about it, lowering myself slowly, my body still unsteady, my mind trying to catch up with everything that had happened. He moved with quiet efficiency, speaking briefly to someone I had not even noticed standing nearby, his voice low, controlled, and within seconds there were footsteps retreating, doors closing softly, like everything around him operated on silent commands. I watched him, unable to look away, trying to understand him, trying to place him into something that made sense, but nothing did. He did not fit into any category my mind could create. He was not just the man who had saved me, and he was not just someone powerful. He was something more, something that carried weight without needing to show it. He turned back to me, his gaze sweeping over me quickly, assessing, not in a way that made me feel judged, but in a way that made me feel accounted for, like nothing about me was being missed. "You need rest," he said, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt impossible. Rest did not belong in a night like this, not after everything that had happened. "I do not think I can sleep," I admitted, my voice quieter now, the exhaustion finally catching up with me in waves that made it hard to focus. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slightly, like he had expected that answer. "Then you will sit," he replied, simple, direct, and somehow grounding. I exhaled slowly, leaning back just enough to let my body relax against the chair, my fingers still gripping the blanket like it was the only thing anchoring me to something real. Silence settled between us again, but it felt different now, less heavy, more deliberate, like he was allowing me space without leaving entirely. And I realized something in that moment that made my thoughts slow. He was not hovering, not controlling every movement, but he was still there, present, aware, like a constant I could not ignore. "Why me?" I asked suddenly, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because it had been building since the moment he stepped out of that car. Because nothing about this made sense. He did not answer right away, his gaze shifting slightly, like he was considering how much to say, or whether to say anything at all. And then he walked a few steps closer, stopping just far enough to keep distance, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air again, that same quiet intensity that had changed everything in the parking lot. "Because," he said slowly, his voice low, steady, "you were already seen." The words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold, my mind racing to understand what he meant, who had seen me, when, how. But before I could ask, before I could piece anything together, he added, softer this time, but somehow more final, "And now, so am I." The words stayed with me long after he said them. echoing in the quiet space like something that refused to fade. You were already seen. I did not understand how that was possible, not fully, but something deep in my chest tightened like my body recognized the truth before my mind could catch up. I shifted slightly in the chair, my fingers loosening their grip on the blanket just enough for the fabric to fall back into place. And for the first time since stepping inside, I became aware of how out of place I must look here. Soaked clothes, trembling hands, eyes that had not stopped scanning for danger. And yet no one rushed me. No one questioned me. Everything around me moved with a quiet efficiency that made it clear this place did not react. It anticipated. I watched as someone entered briefly, placing a glass of water on the table beside me, without a word before disappearing just as quickly. Like a shadow that knew exactly how long it was allowed to exist, I reached for the glass. Slowly, my hand unsteady, the cool surface grounding me in a way I had not expected. I took a small sip, then another, letting the simple act of drinking steady my breathing. He remained nearby, not close enough to feel overwhelming, but not far enough to ignore, his presence constant, like a line drawn in the room that everything else adjusted around. You said I was seen. I began carefully, my voice quieter now, more controlled, because if I was going to understand anything, I needed to ask the right questions. He did not interrupt, did not redirect, just watched, giving me space to continue. When? I asked, and this time, there was no hesitation in his answer. Before tonight, he said, simple, direct, and my heart dropped slightly, because that meant whatever had happened in that parking lot was not random. It was not an isolated moment. It was connected to something larger, something I had stepped into without realizing it. I shook my head faintly, trying to piece it together. I do not know anyone who would. I stopped, because even as I said it, I realized how little that meant, how easy it was to be seen without knowing, to be noticed without understanding why. His gaze did not soften, but it shifted, like he was considering how much to reveal. You were in the wrong place, he said, and I almost responded immediately, almost repeated what he had told me before, that there was no such thing, but this time it sounded different. This time it felt like something more specific. Where? I asked, leaning forward slightly despite the exhaustion pulling at my body, and that was when I saw it. The smallest change in his expression, not hesitation, not uncertainty, just calculation, like he was deciding whether this answer would protect me or pull me deeper. A conversation, he said finally, and my breath caught, because suddenly it made sense, not all of it, but enough, flashes of memory pushing forward, voices I was not meant to hear, words that had not seemed important at the time, but now carried weight I could not ignore. I had not thought about it as anything more than background noise, something to forget, something to move past, but clearly, someone else had thought differently. I did not understand what I heard. I said quickly, the words rushing out before I could stop them, because I needed him to know that, needed him to understand that I was not a threat, that I had not been trying to insert myself into something dangerous. He nodded once, like he believed me, or at least like it did not change anything. It does not matter if you understood, he replied, his voice steady. It matters that someone else thinks you did. The sentence settled heavily between us, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest again. That awareness that this was bigger than me, bigger than one moment, bigger than anything I had been prepared for. I leaned back slowly, my mind racing, trying to catch up, trying to find some way to make sense of it. So they will come after me, I said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization, and this time, he did not correct me, did not soften it, did not offer reassurance that everything would be fine. He simply held my gaze and said, they already did, and the calm certainty in his voice made my pulse spike again, because he was not speaking about possibility, he was speaking about fact, about something that had already begun, something that had already reached me. I looked down at my hands, at the faint marks still visible against my skin, and for a moment, everything felt very clear, very simple. I was no longer standing on the edge of something dangerous. I was already inside it, and when I looked back up at him, searching for something, anything that resembled hesitation or doubt, I found none, only that same steady presence, that same quiet control. Why are you helping me? I asked again, softer this time, because now the question mattered more, now it carried weight. and he stepped just a little closer. Not enough to overwhelm, but enough that I could feel the shift again, that invisible line tightening between us. His voice lower now, quieter, but more certain than anything he had said before, because, he said, holding my gaze, if they are looking at you, they are looking at something that belongs to me now. The words hit me harder than anything else that night. Not loud, not forceful, but final in a way that made my breath catch. Something that belongs to me now. I should have pulled back, should have rejected it, should have said something, anything. But I did not, because part of me understood what he meant, not in the way the words sounded, but in what they implied: protection, control, consequence, all woven into one quiet sentence. I felt my fingers tighten again around the blanket, grounding myself as I searched his face for something, anything that resembled uncertainty. But there was none, only that same calm certainty that made everything else feel smaller, less important. I am not something you can just claim, I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected, and for a moment, the room seemed to still, not because I had challenged him, but because I had drawn a line, however small it was. His gaze did not harden, did not turn cold. Instead it sharpened, like he had been waiting for that response. No, he agreed quietly, and that single word caught me off guard more than anything else, because it was not resistance, it was acknowledgement. You are not. He continued, taking a step closer, slow, deliberate. But the moment someone decided to make you a target, they changed that. I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear alone, but from the weight of what he was saying, because it made sense in a way I did not want it to, because the world he lived in did not follow the same rules as mine, and I had already seen that tonight, had already felt it. You do not get to choose what they started, he added, his voice still calm, still controlled. But you do get to choose how you survive it. The words settled into me, heavy but clear, and for the first time since everything began, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not relief, not exactly, but something steadier, something closer to understanding. I looked away for a second, my gaze dropping to my hands, to the faint marks that were still there, reminders of how quickly things could change, how easily control could be taken, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before. I could not go back, not to before tonight, not to the version of my life that felt simple and predictable. That version did not exist anymore. I lifted my head again, meeting his eyes. And if I say no? I asked quietly, because I needed to know, needed to understand what choice really meant here. His expression did not shift, but something in his posture changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, like he was considering the question in a way that mattered. Then you walk out that door, he said, nodding slightly toward the entrance behind me, and you face whatever is waiting for you without me. The answer was simple, direct, and it left no room for illusion, no false promises, no attempt to convince me with anything other than truth. I felt my chest tighten again, because I knew what was waiting, not exactly who or when or how, but enough to understand that walking out meant stepping back into something I was not prepared for, something that had already reached me once. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight of that choice settled in. It was not really a choice, not in the way choices were supposed to work. It was survival, plain and simple. I let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. You do not make this easy, I said, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in his expression, not a smile, but something close to it, something that softened the edges just enough to remind me that he was not entirely unreachable. Easy is not what keeps people alive, he replied, and there was something in his tone now, something quieter, more personal, like those words came from experience rather than philosophy. I studied him for a moment, really studied him, trying to see past the control, past the calm, to understand the man behind it. But he did not give much away, he never did. So what happens if I stay? I asked, my voice lower now, more certain, because I already knew my answer. I just needed to hear his. He did not hesitate this time, not even for a second. Then you do not face this alone, he said, and the simplicity of it made something in my chest tighten again, because it was not a promise of safety, not a guarantee that nothing would happen. It was something else, something more real, more grounded. He was not offering to remove the danger, He was offering to stand between it and me, and that was different. That meant something. I nodded slowly, the decision settling into me. Like something inevitable, something that had been building since the moment he stepped out of that car. Then I stay, I said quietly, and the moment the words left my lips, I felt it, that invisible shift, like something had locked into place, like a line had been crossed not just physically, but completely, and when I looked at him again, his gaze held mine with that same steady intensity. But now there was something new there, something deeper, something that made my breath catch just slightly as he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that made everything else fall silent. Good, he said, because they are already looking for you, and now they will have to go through me. I did not realize how tense my body still was until the moment I said the words, then I stay, because something inside me finally stopped fighting, not completely, but enough to let the weight settle instead of resisting it. And the strange thing was, it did not feel like giving up. It felt like stepping into something I had been circling since the night began, something inevitable. He did not react the way I expected. There was no visible shift, no sign of satisfaction or relief, just that same quiet acknowledgement, like my decision had simply confirmed what he already knew would happen, and that should have unsettled me more than it did, but instead it grounded me. In a way I could not explain, the room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because the uncertainty was still there. The fear had not disappeared, but it had focused, narrowed into something I could actually face. Instead of something that overwhelmed me from every direction, he turned slightly, his attention shifting beyond me for a brief second, and I followed his gaze instinctively, noticing the subtle movement near the doorway, someone waiting, not intruding, just present enough to be called when needed. Prepare a room, he said, his voice calm, measured, and the response came immediately. Quiet footsteps, a nod I barely caught before the figure disappeared again, and I realized something in that moment. Nothing here was accidental. Every movement, every presence, every silence was intentional, controlled, like a system that had been refined over time. Until it operated without friction, I looked back at him, trying to reconcile that control with the man who had stepped into chaos without hesitation earlier that night. And for the first time, I saw the connection. This was not two different sides of him. It was the same thing, the same precision, the same certainty, applied in different spaces. You do not seem surprised, I said quietly, and he glanced at me again, one eyebrow lifting slightly as if inviting me to continue. About my choice, I added, because it mattered, because I needed to understand if this had always been expected, if I had ever truly had another path. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady, not dismissive, not distant, just aware. People want to believe they have more options than they actually do, he said finally, and the honesty in his tone made my chest tighten again, because he was not trying to comfort me. He was giving me truth, unfiltered. You saw what happens when someone becomes a problem, he continued, his voice lower now, not threatening, just factual, and I nodded slightly, because I had seen enough, felt enough, to understand what he meant without him needing to explain further. Staying was the only logical choice, he finished, and I exhaled slowly, not because I disagreed, but because hearing it said out loud made it more real, more final. I shifted in the chair, the exhaustion settling deeper into my bones now that the immediate danger had passed, my body catching up with everything my mind had been trying to process. What happens tomorrow? I asked, because as much as tonight had changed everything, there was still something ahead, something I could not see yet, and that uncertainty lingered just beneath the surface. He moved slightly closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to make his presence feel more immediate, more deliberate. Tomorrow, he said, pausing just long enough for the word to settle. We make sure they understand the mistake they made. His tone did not change, it remained calm, controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, something that made the air feel heavier for a brief second, and I felt it again. That shift, that reminder that whatever protection he offered came with consequences of its own. I looked at him carefully, trying to read between the lines, trying to understand what that really meant, but as always, he revealed only what he chose to, nothing more, and me. I asked, softer this time, because I needed to know where I fit into all of this, not just tonight, but after. When the immediate threat was gone, if it ever truly would be, his gaze softened just slightly, not enough to change its intensity, but enough to change its direction, like he was looking at me differently now, not just assessing, but considering. "You stay where I can see you," he said, and the words should have felt restrictive, should have made me pull back, but instead they landed differently, not as a command, but as a boundary, a line drawn not to trap me, but to protect me. I nodded slowly, because at this point, I understood what that meant, understood the world I had stepped into just enough to know that visibility was safety here, not limitation. He straightened slightly, his posture shifting back into that composed stillness that seemed to define him, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence settling between us again, but it felt different now, less uncertain, more established, like something had been set into motion that neither of us intended to interrupt. And as I sat there, in a place that did not belong to me, beside a man I barely understood, I realized something that made my breath slow just slightly. I was no longer waiting for something to happen. It already had, and whatever came next would not be something I could walk away from. The silence stretched just long enough for me to notice it again, that strange feeling of being watched without being watched, like the walls themselves were aware, like every movement I made was quietly acknowledged even when no one was visibly there. And for the first time since I had walked inside, I became aware of how exposed I still felt, not physically, but mentally, like I had stepped into a place where nothing could be hidden, where even the smallest hesitation could be seen and understood. I shifted slightly in the chair, my fingers finally releasing the tight grip on the blanket, letting it fall more naturally around my shoulders, and the small act felt significant, like I was slowly adjusting to the space instead of resisting it. He remained where he was, not speaking, not moving, unnecessarily, but present in a way that filled the room without effort, and I realized something that unsettled me in a quieter way. I was starting to get used to it, to him, to the way his presence grounded the chaos instead of adding to it. And that realization was dangerous in its own way, because it meant I was adapting, not escaping. "You should change," he said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence without disrupting it. I looked up at him, slightly confused until I followed his gaze to my clothes, still damp, still carrying traces of the night I had not fully processed yet. I nodded slowly, realizing he was right, that I could not keep sitting here like this, caught between what had happened and what was coming next. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the hallway. "There is a room prepared for you," he added, and the way he said it made it clear that everything had already been arranged, anticipated, like my presence here had shifted things into motion the moment I stepped inside. I stood carefully, my legs still unsteady but stronger than before, the exhaustion settling into a dull ache instead of something overwhelming. And for a brief second, I hesitated, looking at him again, because walking away, even just down a hallway, felt like stepping out of the only place I understood in this moment, which was him, and that thought alone was enough to make my chest tighten. He noticed. Of course he did, his gaze shifting slightly, not questioning, not pressing, just acknowledging the hesitation. "You are still within my reach," he said quietly, and something about the way he said it made it easier to move, not because it reassured me completely, but because it removed the uncertainty just enough. I turned and followed the direction he had indicated, my footsteps soft against the floor, the hallway stretching out ahead of me in clean lines and muted tones, everything consistent, everything controlled, doors spaced evenly, lighting soft but deliberate. And I wondered how many people had walked these halls, how many stories had unfolded here without ever reaching the outside world. I reached the door at the end, pausing for just a second before pushing it open. The room inside was exactly what I expected and nothing like what I had known before, large but not overwhelming, simple but clearly expensive, everything in its place, everything untouched, like it had been waiting, not lived in. I stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind me, and for the first time since the night began, I was alone, truly alone, and the silence hit differently here, less controlled, more personal, like it gave my thoughts space to return all at once. I leaned back against the door, closing my eyes briefly as the weight of everything settled over me again. The parking lot, the voices, the moment he appeared, the way everything shifted after that. It all replayed in fragments, Incomplete, but enough to remind me that none of this was normal. None of this was something I could simply move past. I opened my eyes again, pushing myself away from the door and moving further into the room, noticing the clothes laid out neatly on the bed, simple, comfortable, chosen without needing my input. And that realization made me pause, because it meant he had already considered what I would need before I asked, before I even realized it myself. I reached out slowly, brushing my fingers against the fabric, grounding myself again. And for a moment, I just stood there, trying to understand how my life had shifted so completely in such a short time. How I had gone from trying to escape one situation to stepping into something far more complex, far more controlled, and yet strangely safer. I let out a slow breath, running my hands through my hair as I moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look outside. The world beyond was quiet, distant, like it existed on a different level entirely. And I realized something then that made my chest tighten again. I was not just hiding here. I was being kept here, protected, yes, but also contained, and the difference between those two things was something I had not fully figured out yet. I turned away from the window, my gaze falling back to the room, to the door, to the space I now occupied. And for a moment, everything felt still, suspended, like I was standing between two versions of my life, one I had already lost, and one I did not fully understand yet. And somewhere beyond that door, beyond this room, beyond everything I could see, he was still there, still watching, still aware, and for reasons I could not explain. That thought did not make me feel trapped. It made me feel like I was exactly where I was meant to be, whether I was ready for it or not. I did not change right away, even though the clothes were right there within reach. Even though everything about the room suggested that I should, that I was expected to settle in, to adapt, to accept. Instead, I stayed by the window a little longer, my fingers resting lightly against the cool glass as I watched the faint outline of the grounds beyond. The dim lights placed with intention, not to illuminate everything, but to control what could be seen and what remained hidden. And that thought stayed with me, because it felt like a reflection of him, of this place. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was left to chance. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned away slowly, my gaze drifting back to the bed, to the clothes that had been chosen for me without a single question, and I realized how strange that should have felt, how invasive it could have been, but it did not entirely, because there was something in the way everything had been handled tonight that made it clear. This was not about control for the sake of control. It was about certainty, about eliminating variables, about making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. I moved closer, my hand brushing over the fabric again before I finally picked it up, the softness unexpected, grounding. And for a moment, I just stood there, holding it, letting the silence settle around me, letting my thoughts catch up in fragments instead of chaos. Then slowly, I began to change, each movement deliberate, almost mechanical at first, like my body was relearning how to function outside of survival mode. And as the damp fabric fell away, replaced by something dry, something warm, I felt the smallest shift inside me. Not relief, not comfort, but something quieter, something steadier, like I was beginning to exist in this new space instead of just reacting to it. I sat on the edge of the bed when I was done, my hands resting in my lap, my breathing slower now, more controlled, and for the first time since everything began, I allowed myself to think forward instead of backward, to consider what came next instead of what had already happened. But the moment I did, his voice echoed in my mind again. You stay where I can see you. And I realized how that statement had changed something in me, how it had shifted from something that could have felt restrictive into something that felt defined, like a boundary I could understand instead of a cage I needed to escape. I leaned back slightly, my eyes drifting toward the door, aware of the distance between us now, aware that he was somewhere beyond it, still present, even without being visible. And the strange thing was, that awareness did not make me feel alone. It did the opposite. It anchored me. And that realization should have unsettled me more than it did. I stood again after a moment, moving toward the door slowly, my hand hovering over the handle as hesitation crept back in. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, because stepping out meant stepping back into his presence, into that space where everything felt sharper, more defined, more real. I took a slow breath and opened the door. The hallway was just as quiet as before, unchanged, like time had not moved at all while I had been inside. I stepped out, closing the door behind me with a soft click, and for a brief second, I simply stood there, listening, feeling, adjusting. Then I began to walk, my steps more steady now, more certain, following the same path I had taken before, and as I moved, I noticed it again. That subtle awareness of being observed, not watched in a way that felt invasive, but acknowledged, like my presence here mattered, like it was accounted for. I reached the end of the hallway and paused, my gaze shifting toward the open space beyond, and there he was, exactly where I expected him to be, standing near the same place I had left him, as if he had not moved at all, as if everything else had shifted around him instead, his posture unchanged, his presence just as controlled, just as steady. And for a moment, I simply watched him, trying to understand how someone could hold that much stillness without it feeling empty. He noticed me immediately. Of course he did, his gaze lifting to meet mine without hesitation, without surprise, like he had been aware of me the entire time, and something in my chest tightened again, not from fear, but from the intensity of that connection, from the way his attention seemed to settle so completely once it found me. "You came back," he said quietly, and the words should have sounded obvious, should have felt unnecessary, but they did not, because there was something beneath them, something that made it clear he was not just acknowledging my presence, he was acknowledging my choice. I nodded slowly, stepping closer, the distance between us closing in a way that felt different now, more intentional, less uncertain. I said I would stay. I replied, my voice calm, steady in a way it had not been before, and for a moment, the silence returned, but it felt different now, not empty, not heavy, but settled, like something had aligned, like a balance had been established. He studied me for a second longer, his gaze tracing over the changes, the steadiness in my posture, the absence of that earlier hesitation, and I saw it then, the smallest shift in his expression, not approval, not satisfaction, but recognition, like he was seeing me differently now, not just as someone he had pulled out of danger, but as someone who had stepped into his world and chosen to remain. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet certainty that had defined everything from the beginning. "Good," he said softly, "because tomorrow, you will need to understand exactly what you have stepped into." His words did not feel like a warning. They felt like a certainty, like whatever tomorrow held had already been decided, and I was simply being allowed to catch up to it. And for the first time since this night began, I felt something shift deeper than fear or confusion, something quieter, heavier, like anticipation mixed with something I could not fully name. I held his gaze for a moment longer before letting out a slow breath, steadying myself in a way that felt more intentional now, less reactive. "Then tell me now," I said softly, because waiting suddenly felt impossible, because the unknown was harder to sit with than the truth. No matter how complicated it was, he watched me carefully, not surprised by the request, but measuring it, like he was deciding how much I was ready to hear. And after a brief pause, he moved slightly, gesturing for me to follow him. "Walk with me," he said, his tone calm, but carrying that same quiet authority that left no room for hesitation, and I followed without thinking, my steps falling into rhythm beside his as we moved through the space, past rooms I had not seen before, past doors that remained closed, past areas that felt just as controlled and deliberate as everything else here, and I realized something as we walked. This place was not just a home, it was a system, a structure designed to function without disruption, every detail serving a purpose, every movement accounted for. We stopped near a large window that overlooked the grounds, the darkness outside broken only by carefully placed lights that revealed just enough and nothing more. And he stood there for a moment, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his posture relaxed but still precise. "You think tonight was random," he began, his voice low, steady, and I felt my attention sharpen immediately, focusing completely on him. "It was not," he continued, and something in my chest tightened, because I had already suspected that, but hearing it confirmed made it more real, more concrete. "You were seen days ago," he added, and I felt my breath catch slightly, my mind racing back, searching for the moment, the place, the detail I had missed. "At the restaurant," he said before I could ask, and everything clicked into place. The conversation I had overheard without meaning to. the voices that had not seemed important at the time, the way I had dismissed it, thinking it had nothing to do with me. I shook my head faintly, the realization settling in slowly. I did not even know what they were talking about. I said, my voice quieter now, because that part still mattered to me, still felt like it should make a difference. He turned slightly, his gaze meeting mine again. It does not matter what you know, he repeated, his tone unchanged. It matters what they believe you know. And the words landed heavier this time, because now I understood the full weight of them. Now I understood why tonight had happened, why I had been there, why he had stepped in. I looked away briefly, my gaze dropping to the floor as I processed it, trying to connect the version of my life from yesterday to the one I was standing in now, and failing, because they did not belong to the same world anymore. And you? I asked after a moment, lifting my head again. How are you connected to this? Because that question had been building, because nothing about this made sense without him being part of it in a way I had not yet seen. His expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something that made the air feel slightly heavier, like I had stepped closer to something important. Because what you heard belongs to me, he said simply, and the calm way he delivered that truth made my pulse spike again, because it confirmed everything I had been trying not to assume, because it meant I had not just stepped into something dangerous, I had stepped directly into his world, into something he controlled, something he was responsible for. I took a small step back without realizing it, not out of fear exactly, but out of the weight of that realization, and he noticed, of course he did, but he did not move, did not close the distance. He simply let me process it, let me adjust, and that restraint felt just as powerful as everything else about him. So this is your fault, I said before I could stop myself, the words coming out sharper than I intended, and for a brief second, the silence between us shifted, not tense, but charged, like something important had just been acknowledged. He did not deny it, did not deflect, he simply held my gaze and said, "It is my responsibility." And the difference between those two things settled into me slowly, changing the way I understood everything that had happened, because responsibility meant he was not stepping in out of obligation alone. It meant he was choosing to take control of the situation, choosing to stand between me and whatever came next. I exhaled slowly, my thoughts beginning to align in a way they had not before. So tomorrow, I said quietly, is not about them. And his gaze sharpened slightly, like I had finally caught up to something he had been waiting for me to understand. No, he replied, his voice steady. Tomorrow is about making sure this never happens again. And something in the way he said it made my breath catch, not because it sounded threatening, but because it sounded final, like whatever line had been crossed tonight would not be crossed again. Not with me, not while I was here. And for the first time since this began, I realized something that made everything else fall quiet for just a second. I was not just being protected. I was being claimed as part of something much larger than I had ever imagined. The realization settled into me slowly, not like a shock, but like something heavier, something that stayed, that refused to fade even when I tried to look away from it. I was no longer standing outside of his world, observing it from a distance. I was inside it, connected to it in a way that could not be undone. And the strange part was not the danger of it, not the uncertainty, but the clarity that came with it. Because for the first time since this began, I understood my place, not completely, not in every detail, but enough to know that I was no longer drifting between choices. I had made one, and it had changed everything. I let out a slow breath, my eyes shifting back to him as I tried to steady my thoughts. And what does that make me? I asked quietly, because that question mattered more than anything else now, because understanding my position in all of this meant understanding what came next, what was expected, what was inevitable. He did not answer immediately, his gaze holding mine with that same steady intensity, like he was measuring the weight of the question before deciding how to respond. And for a moment, the silence stretched between us, not empty, but deliberate, like it was part of the answer itself. It makes you visible, he said finally, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected, not a title, not a role, just a state, something that carried meaning without needing explanation. I frowned slightly, trying to understand what that really meant, because visibility had already been the problem. It was the reason I was here, the reason everything had unfolded the way it had. Visible to who? I asked, my voice quieter now, more focused, and this time, his answer came without hesitation. To everyone who matters, he said, and something in the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it carried weight, because it implied something larger than just the situation I had stumbled into. It implied a network, a structure, a world that extended far beyond what I could see from this room. I shifted slightly, my mind trying to catch up again, trying to process what being visible in his world actually meant, because it was not the same as being seen in mine. Here, visibility was not passive, it was deliberate. It meant something, it carried consequences. That does not sound like protection, I said carefully, because I needed to understand the difference, needed to know if stepping into his world had truly made me safer or just more exposed. His expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his gaze, like he was acknowledging the question without dismissing. It is not, he said simply, and the honesty in his answer made my breath catch again, because he was not trying to make this easier than it was, not trying to soften it into something I could accept without thinking. Protection does not come from being hidden, he continued, his voice steady. It comes from being known and untouchable. The last words settled between us with a weight that made everything else fall quiet for a moment, because it carried certainty, because it implied control, because it meant that visibility here was not about exposure. It was about positioning. I looked at him carefully, trying to understand how someone could make something like that sound so absolute, so guaranteed. But then I remembered everything I had seen tonight, the way he moved, the way the world seemed to adjust around him, the way nothing felt uncertain when he was present, and I realized that to him. It was not a theory, it was reality. And you can make that happen? I asked, not challenging, not doubting, just trying to understand the extent of what he was offering, what I had stepped into. His gaze did not waver, did not shift, it remained steady, unwavering, like the answer had never been in question. I already have, he said quietly, and the certainty in his voice sent a different kind of chill through me. Not fear, but something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to trust. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight of everything settled into something more structured, more defined, and for the first time, I felt like I was beginning to understand the rules of this world, not completely, but enough to move forward without hesitation. So tomorrow, I said, my voice steadier now, is not just about fixing what happened, and his gaze sharpened slightly, like I had touched on something important, something central. No, he replied, his tone calm but firm. Tomorrow is about showing them what happens when they miscalculate. And the way he said, it made my breath catch again, because it was not about reaction, it was about control, about setting a precedent, about making sure that what happened tonight would not repeat itself, not because it could not, but because no one would dare to try. I nodded slowly, the understanding settling deeper now, aligning with everything I had felt, but not fully grasped until this moment. I was not just being protected from what had already happened, I was being positioned in a way that would prevent it from happening again. And that difference changed everything. I looked at him one more time, my gaze steady now, matching his in a way it had not before, and for a brief second, the silence between us felt almost balanced, like we were standing on the same level, understanding the same truth from different sides. And when I finally spoke, my voice carried a quiet certainty that surprised even me. Then I guess tomorrow is not just about them learning a lesson, I said, and he held my gaze. That same faint recognition returning to his expression, like he was seeing something new again, something he had been waiting for. No, he said softly. It is about you understanding your place in this world. And something in the way he said it made me realize, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that whatever tomorrow brought, it would not just change how others saw me, it would change how I saw myself. Sleep did not come the way I expected it to. It did not arrive all at once or pull me under into something deep and quiet. Instead, it came in fragments, light and shifting, like my mind refused to fully let go. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back in that moment, the cold pavement, the sudden silence, the way everything had changed when he appeared, but each time the memory replayed, it felt different, less chaotic, more structured, like my mind was trying to understand it instead of just survive it. And somewhere between those fragments, I drifted into something softer, something that felt almost still, until the faint light filtering through the curtains pulled me back. I opened my eyes slowly, the unfamiliar ceiling above me grounding me in the present, reminding me that none of it had been a dream, that everything that happened last night had followed me here, into this room. Into this new reality I was only beginning to understand. I pushed myself up slightly, the blanket falling away from my shoulders as I sat there, letting the quiet settle around me. It was different in the morning. The silence felt less heavy, less controlled, like the space had softened just enough to breathe. But the awareness was still there, that subtle sense of being part of something larger, something that extended beyond the walls of this room. I stood after a moment, moving toward the window again, pulling the curtain back to let the light in fully. The grounds outside looked different in daylight, clearer, more defined, but still just as intentional. Every detail placed with purpose, every line clean and precise. And for the first time, I saw it not just as something intimidating, but as something structured, something that made sense in its own way. I rested my hand against the glass, my thoughts quieter now, more focused, because everything he had said the night before had settled into something I could hold on to, something I could build from. I was not here by accident. I was here because a line had been crossed, because I had been seen, and because he had chosen to step in, and that choice had changed everything. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts, and I turned slightly, my body tensing for just a second before I caught myself, before I remembered where I was. "Come in," I said, my voice steady, and the door opened just enough for someone to step inside. Not him, but someone else, composed, quiet, carrying a tray with a kind of precision that mirrored everything else in this place. They set it down on the table without a word, offering a small nod before stepping back toward the door. "He is waiting for you," they said simply, and the words settled into me immediately, not as a surprise, but as something expected, something inevitable. I nodded once, watching as they left as quietly as they had entered, the door closing softly behind them. And for a moment, I just stood there, taking in the shift, the transition from night to morning, from reaction to intention, because that was what this felt like now. Not survival, but movement. I dressed quickly, the actions more natural now, less mechanical, like my body had begun to adjust to this new rhythm. And when I finished, I paused briefly, my hand resting on the door handle, aware of what stepping outside meant, aware that whatever came next would not just be about understanding, but about becoming part of it. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the same quiet space now carrying a different energy, less uncertain, more defined, and I moved forward without hesitation, my steps steady as I followed the path back. And when I reached the open area, he was already there, exactly where I expected him to be, standing near the window, the morning light casting subtle shadows across his features, making him look even more composed, even more certain. He turned as I approached, his gaze finding mine instantly, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us carrying something new now, not just awareness, but recognition. Like this was no longer the beginning of something unfamiliar, but the continuation of something already set in motion. "You are awake," he said, his voice calm, measured, and I nodded slightly, stepping closer, my posture steady, my thoughts aligned in a way they had not been before. "I am ready," I replied, and the words felt different leaving my mouth, stronger, more certain, because they were not just about this moment, they were about everything that followed, everything I had stepped into without fully understanding until now. His gaze held mine for a second longer, and I saw it again, that subtle shift, that recognition, like he was seeing the change, the difference between the person I had been last night and the one standing in front of him now. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same quiet authority, but there was something else beneath it now, something that felt almost like approval. "Good," he said, "because today, you stop reacting to this world." He paused just long enough for the words to settle, for me to understand the shift in them, the weight of what he was about to say next, and you start learning how to stand in it. His words did not feel like guidance. They felt like a line being drawn, something quiet but absolute. And I felt it settle into me as I stood there facing him, no longer uncertain, no longer trying to understand what this world was from the outside, because now I was inside it, and more than that, I was expected to stand in it, not hide from it, not wait for it to pass, but exist within it with intention. I held his gaze, letting the weight of that settle fully before I nodded, not out of agreement alone, but out of recognition, because something inside me had already shifted to meet it. Then show me, I said, my voice steady, and for the first time, there was the faintest change in him, not visible to anyone who was not looking closely, but I was. I had learned to, a slight pause, a subtle narrowing of his gaze, like he had been waiting for that answer, not expecting it, but measuring it. And then he turned, motioning for me to follow again, and this time, I did not hesitate at all, my steps matching his without thought. Without question, we moved through the space differently now, not as someone being led and someone leading, but as two people moving with the same purpose, even if we understood it differently. We entered a room I had not seen before, larger than the others, more open, with a long table at its center and screens along the far wall displaying information I could not fully process at first glance. Names, locations, movement, everything shifting in real time like a living map of something far beyond this place. I slowed slightly as I took it in, my eyes scanning the details, trying to understand what I was looking at, and I felt it again, that awareness, not overwhelming this time, but grounding, like I was beginning to see the structure instead of just feeling it. This is where decisions are made, he said, his voice low but clear, and I turned toward him, my attention sharpening. Immediately, because this was it. This was the center of it, the place where everything connected, where everything was controlled. I stepped further into the room, my movements slower now, more deliberate, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this mattered, that being here meant something. He watched me as I moved, not directing, not correcting, just observing, allowing me to take it in on my own terms. And that alone told me more than anything else could. This was not about forcing me into something. It was about showing me what I had stepped into so I could choose how to stand within it. I stopped near the table, my fingers brushing lightly against the surface as I looked at the screens again, trying to make sense of the patterns, the connections, and slowly, piece by piece, it began to form, not completely, not all at once, but enough to understand that this was not chaos. It was control, layered, precise, intentional. I turned back to him, my expression focused. Now, clearer than it had been since the night began. And they are part of this, I said, not asking, but confirming, and he nodded once, the movement small but decisive. They are a piece of it, he replied, and something in the way he said it made me realize how much larger this was than I had allowed myself to consider, how what had happened to me was not an isolated event, but a disruption, a miscalculation in a system that did not tolerate mistakes. I felt my breath steady as that. Understanding settled in, not overwhelming me, but aligning something inside me, something that had been shifting since the moment I stepped into that car. And me? I asked again, but this time the question was different, not uncertain, not searching, but grounded, because now I understood what I was asking. I understood the weight of it. He stepped closer, not enough to close the space completely, but enough to make his presence more immediate, more defined. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet certainty that had followed me from the beginning. You are the reason this changes, he said, and the words landed differently than anything else he had said before, because they did not define me by what had happened. They defined me by what came next, by the impact, by the shift. I held his gaze, feeling that settle into me, feeling the way it reshaped everything I had been thinking, everything I had been trying to understand, because it meant I was not just part of this world now. I was a point of change within it, and that realization did not feel heavy the way I expected it to. It felt clear. I straightened slightly, my shoulders settling, my posture shifting in a way that felt natural, not forced, like something inside me had aligned with the space around me. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was trying to keep up. I felt like I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be. Then I will learn, I said quietly, and the words felt solid, certain, like they belonged to me in a way nothing else had since this began. He watched me for a moment longer, that same recognition returning, stronger now, more defined, and then he gave the smallest nod, like a decision had just been confirmed, something unspoken but understood, and as the silence settled between us again, it did not feel like